Well, welcome to this session. You're obviously aware the topic is climate change and energy, and it is topical. I think I've heard climate come up in at least 3 of the sessions today. So we're here to discuss and answer as many of your questions as possible on what's always a very interesting topic. Now, in introducing our panel, I've said they're all fabulously knowledgeable people, and they are, because I've talked to them and met them, and they're all experts in so many areas. But the first question I thought would be interesting to hear from each of them, and I'll ask them to each speak to the same question because they will bring a particular expertise to it, is in relation to that question of a target or an aspirational target. And that is whether or not a target of net zero emissions by 2050 is achievable, and what's the key to achieving it. And I've added one little twist to the question, and that is I'd like the panellists to speak to that both globally as well as locally.
Farmers have always been custodians of land and always are looking to improve the land. So I think from a cultural point of view, this is a really good fit. I didn't think I'd do this, but I disagree with Jack. He said that we wouldn't be able to feed 10 billion people by 2050. And no disrespect, Jack, it's a much smarter guy. Sorry, Jack. But I think we will. I think that in the last 50 years in Australia, we've more than doubled our yields. And if you look at the corn crop, even in the US, 50 years ago, it was 30 bushels to the acre. Now we're average yields of 170 bushels to the acre. There is a huge amount of technology that's gone into that. And then when I see where the money is flowing in agriculture now into soil science, gene editing and those sorts of things, and you can have your own views of whether you think that some of the CRISPR technology is good or bad, but the reality is technology is going to help us in that space, and that's going to be something that's really moving forward for us. GPS technology, variable rate technology, all those things that in the first world we take for granted. And here's where I move into the global, my global position is taken for granted. All of those things in the first world, in countries like China, in India, and very much in Africa are not. Yields are still very low, very inefficient, and the second largest contribution to greenhouse gases from agriculture comes from nitrogen-based products, which are very much overused in those countries. So I think the numbers that we do internally say that if we could get the whole of the globe using nitrogen fertilisers in just the right amounts, using tissue testing, soil testing, and all of the modern variable rate sort of by the inch applications, right place, right time, then we could reduce emissions by 15% across the whole industry. So there's a long way to go.
Thanks. Robyn?
That's great. So by very nature, I'm a technology optimist, and with this ambitious goal, catalysing technologists around the world and also locally, we'll actually be able to move the ball forward much faster than we would otherwise have done. Canada and Australia in this room, we both have a history of resource-intensive countries and also historically relied on fossil fuels and exploitation of those minerals as well. And it's been a significant part of our economy, but we also have tremendous potential in the renewable space, both solar, hydro, wind, and a range of other technologies as well. And because of our geography and our topography, we actually are in a better position than most other countries to deploy those and take a leading position to actually trial and use these technologies across the 2 countries. So if you look at the technology, we actually have it now to make significant inroads into reducing carbon emissions, and we don't have to wait till 2050. If I take Tesla, for example, and what we're doing across the globe, our whole mission as a company was founded to actually move the world towards sustainable energy. And we're only founded in 2003, so it's not that long ago that even putting that type of ambition out there was, not heard of. So the things that we're doing today, if you look at the electric vehicle fleet from Tesla alone, it's over 800,000 vehicles today as of Q4 of 2019. And that's grown pretty significantly with the introduction of the Model 3, which is really accelerated. So last year we delivered 367,000 vehicles into the global ecosystem. And that was 50% more than the prior year. The other thing is that even though from a very small base in Australia, in the last year, we've tripled the number of EVs across the board in the Australian marketplace. So for me, the other thing that's happening there is, obviously all other automakers around the globe have all got electric vehicle programs or other renewable energy programs. The other thing that's also true is on the energy side, using a lot of the battery technology and deploying batteries with the renewable energy has really enabled us to help shore up the grid and make renewables much more economic as well. So if we look at Australia, for example, the Hornsdale project, which we've talked a lot about, has been hugely successful. Not only is it the largest battery in the world today with a renewable energy program at 100 megawatts, it's also just been announced that they're going to increase it by 50%, and that's Nutrien, who's the operator of that facility, the owner of that facility. The other thing, because I always get the counterpoint that it's not economic to do batteries and renewables. Actually, that's not the case. This particular program, they're saving tens of millions of dollars per annum in terms of that program itself. So the other thing is also true. I think consumers, we talked about electric vehicles, but also on the PV side and batteries, consumers are actually speaking with their feet, so to speak. In Australia, we have the highest levels of residential solar pretty much of anywhere in the world per capita, with 2.2 million PV installations in Australia, some of which with batteries and some of which aren't. That battery is penetration rate is increasing. We're seeing corporates look at their energy usage and actually driving technological changes in terms of how they're using energy with battery technology and also with other uses of PV as well. So, so from my perspective, the big policy goals are up to the policymakers in terms of the amount of, or the targets that we set. But I really want to stress that technology is available now to actually make significant inroads into that as we move forward. And so with the right technology, which is already available, and the right mindset, we can make significant reduction in the amount of CO2 in our lifetimes in the position today.
The question is, can we get to net zero emissions by 2050 and how to do so? So I'll begin as a professor. I have to be canonical, so I'll refer to the Nobel Prize winning Danish physicist Niels Bohr, who said prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. So, but I'll take a stab at it. And I think the answer is yes, we can do this, provided that we massively electrify. Electricity is tantamount to modernity. Almost everything that we value as contributing to a 21st century lifestyle is predicated on the availability of electricity. But we haven't gone far enough in sustainability. Here, I mean beyond sustainable generation. I'm talking beyond the photovoltaics and the wind and the hydro. Electricity is the key to decarbonization. For example, we need to retire the blast furnace in order to produce steel without greenhouse gas emissions. You might say, steel? Why is he talking about steel? It might surprise you to learn that in 2018, I don't have the figures yet for 2019, but in 2018, the world steel industry contributed 9% to total CO2 emissions. That's not 9% of what came from the manufacturing sector. That's 9% of total CO2 emissions. So if we were to put that in context and we were to rank by country, who are the biggest emitters of CO2? Number one is China, number two is US, and if steel were a country, the third largest emitter is the Republic of Steel. That's how big it is. And behind that is concrete, and behind that is chemicals, which is a euphemism for petrochemicals. So if you take steel, concrete, and chemicals, that's almost 25% of CO2. And that has to be addressed. It's you do what you want about tailpipe emissions from passenger vehicles. These are the giants. You have to get those away or else you're not going to make it. And it's not glam tech, it's not sexy, but that's what has to be addressed. So, you know, I started a company, Boston Metal, that can produce steel without greenhouse gas emissions. It's audacious, but as you say, you want moonshot, there's a moonshot. And go beyond that. I say that ultimately, see, I'm an electrochemist, and because it's the correct way. You use electricity that has been generated without carbon emissions, and then use the electron to drive all of your chemical processes, including even your thermal processes. So I say in the future, ultimately, all industrial chemistry will become industrial electrochemistry. And now, hydrocarbons are no longer fuels. Now, we don't burn them anymore. We only use them as feedstocks to make chemicals, fabrics, what have you. That changes the world very much. The last missing piece, because we're going to be burning hydrocarbons for the foreseeable future. Even if we want to get to zero carbon by 2050, we're going to be burning hydrocarbons for the foreseeable future. So what's the remedy there? Develop the technology that destroys CO2 before it goes up the stack. That way you can burn coal, get the thermal value without CO2 emissions. Everybody else says, oh, if we want to stop CO2 emissions from coal, we have to stop burning coal. No, you can burn coal, just don't. You know, when I was a child, let's go back to when I was at U of T. In every classroom they had, pardon me, in every classroom they had an ashtray at every seat. Everybody smoked. And then they said, no, smoking's bad. You can smoke, you just can't exhale. So the same thing, you can burn coal, but you just don't vent. So this will buy us the time that we need to develop nuclear fusion. And once we have nuclear fusion, electricity will be too cheap to meter, and then the price of petroleum, natural gas, and coal will collapse. And we'll shift away from them not because it's green to do so, it's because everything else is cheaper. And parenthetically, it happens to be green. But it's a long journey from the lab bench to the market. It's not like writing apps for a smartphone. This is not tiny tech, it's heavy industry. But the problem must be tackled if we're going to have a climate solution. And it's not about entrepreneurship. We're not producing consumer goods. This is about science and service to society.
Yeah.
Wonderful act to follow. Thanks, Don. What we've seen in Australia is that, of course, we're in the middle of extraordinary change. The energy landscape is undergoing a remarkable and unstoppable transformation. And we're also grappling with the challenge of climate change and the need to reduce greenhouse gases, as well as the need to adapt to our changing climate. And this bushfire season has changed everything. The conversations that we've been having with our clients over the last 6 weeks are completely different to anything that we have had for the last 35 years. The reality of climate change is facing everyone in Australia, and business knows it needs to change and it needs to react. So against that backdrop, the answer to the question is, can we reach, the answer to the question of can we reach net zero emissions by 2050? Absolutely yes. If you look at the report and the work of the International Energy Agency in the context of the scenarios work they did, I mean, we're full of alphabet soup here. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their special report on 1.5 degrees. The IEA did 4 scenarios in there, and in all 4 of those scenarios, they demonstrated it's possible to get to net zero emissions, and in 2 of those scenarios, they demonstrated it's possible to reach there by 2050. If you take a bit more of a look into the IEA's data set, you'll see that at least 50, if not 75% of current emissions reduction required to 2050 is already available at commercial scale or directly scalable now. So we have the technology to address at least 50% of the emissions. And the pragmatist in me says, well, let's start doing that. Because by the time we get to the end of that 50%, we'll have worked out the kinks in the other 50%, and we'll deliver what we need by 2050. What we do, however, need to recognize is that we're not doing this in isolation. We're doing this against a backdrop, We're doing this against a backdrop of a changing environment. The work that we did for the Commonwealth Bank, which they published in their annual report last year, which looked at the impact that climate change has on their agricultural loan book, and looked using best available science over a 5 by 5 kilometre grid, looking at what impact climate variables have on farm productivity and therefore the ability of the farmer to pay back their loan. Without an adaptive response, at least 50% of their loan book was at risk. But we know, as we've been told by Rob today, that farmers are changing. Farmers are adapting and have been adapting for years and will continue to do so. So taking into account a business as usual adaptive response, at least 75% of that loan book was secure. So we're looking at the need to reduce emissions, not only to change the electricity system, but we're having to do this against a backdrop of significant change in the environment, which gives us an extraordinary opportunity. The decisions we have to take now are not insignificant. We have to look at what it means when we get climate change, the influence of AI and IoT, the millennials coming into the workforce and understanding what they want. And when you combine this with a changing environment and the need to radically decarbonize our economies, we're at a point of extraordinary opportunity because we've got big decisions to take. We know what the technologies are. We need to innovate in finance structures and in business models. And there's extraordinary opportunity out there. The companies which we're talking to aren't taking decisions because it's for the good of the planet. They're taking decisions because it's for the good of their company. And every decision that we're seeing taken is an absolutely economically rational one. I'll comment about policy as well. We need policy clarity. It will be useful. The current lack of clarity just obscures the business models that we're able to investigate. In spite of that, sensible companies are taking sensible decisions to position themselves well for the next 20 years. Just to link into a comment that I heard this morning, the other part of how to address this challenge is we need to get companies to change how they talk about this. We need them to understand that changing this is about an investment in their business. It's an opportunity, it's not a cost. And addressing risks means you're unlocking the opportunities, and that addressing your climate change response and decarbonization is absolutely transformative. The marketplace will change. There will be new products and new services. And businesses must have vision in order for them to have a place in a different economy. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Question now from Nancy Southern.
I would like to ask, so which is going to come first? The economic sequestration from hydrocarbons, because we have not, and perhaps Grant, you said that you were going to talk a little bit more about sequestration, but where are we at in the race or the economic battle to get the sequestration from hydrocarbons in order to produce the sulfur and the carbon fiber materials that the world is now starting to demand in greater capacity?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said earlier about sequestration to me is sort of, it's like a time delay. You can only put so much of CO2 into caverns and pressurized vessels. We're generating it. I mean, in 2018, it was 37 gigatons. You can't hide 37 gigatons unless you go to science fiction kind of pressures. So I think this is all dependent upon being able to in situ destroy CO2 before it goes up the stack. And then you can continue to burn, and you'll get the sulfur, and you'll get the carbon fiber, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it has to be all of the above. I think somebody this morning talked about there's no single solution, no silver bullet. I can't remember what the term was, but it is that. So, to the question earlier, I was being a little bit flippant there, but the whole business, I do not imagine electrification of articulated lorries. See, I know some of these terms. Articulated lorries that are carrying a payload of 20 tons, and that being battery operated. I just don't see it, because if you put the articulated lorry with 20 tons, 10 tons is battery. And so it's just the battery powers the truck, which then, that's stupid. So, but maybe a hydrogen fuel cell would give the truck the ability to go for, some hundreds of kilometers without having to stop and charge and so on. But it has to be all of the above. We need everything. And by the way, I include nuclear fission too. If people are going to say, oh, no, it's too dangerous and so on. You say that, then I change my answer for 2050.
Yeah.
It is, Canada has the nuclear. France, I mean, you're going to go to France and say, shut all this down and install windmills? No, that's stupid.
Everything has to work. Dominic, we agree with that. We have a question from Jennifer Westacott.
Just a quick question on carbon, on CO2 recycling. So on the panel that I was on TV the other night, on the infamous Q&A, there was a young woman whose company was about CO2 recycling, and then I'd been with the Japanese the week before, and they were doing a sort of CO2 recycling. Maybe, Don, just talk us through, or others, what is that real, scalable? Because it goes to your fundamental point. If the task is to reduce emissions, then the policy suite has to be about reducing emissions, not taking out a particular industry, which is where the divisiveness happens in the community's mind. If we could get everyone focused on the 2050 and on the task being emissions reduction, we could make progress. What's your view on CO2 recycling? Everyone, I guess.
That's just invest in the research. There's no reason why you can't catalytically break down CO2. And so that's step one. Just turn it into anything but CO2, ABC, anything but CO2. All right? Now, the more elevated response would be, not only do I break it down, but I turn it into something useful. Maybe I can use that carbon for some new product, or maybe I break it down into CO, and then the CO goes back into the combustor, and you've got this loop. Now it takes energy to do to run this process. Where do I get the energy from? I get it from the sun. And you start thinking in these ways, and you've got this autogenous system that can work.
If you could join me in thanking our panel members for a very insightful contribution, and thank you for your questions. Thank you.